Okay, I think that's recording. Okay, thanks, Joe, for doing this. We'll just go through each section as it comes. The first one is about reading in history. When you're looking at, say, a paper two, source paper, how important is the vocabulary in the text that you're reading?
So I think, and this will tie a lot into what you were talking about in terms of academic literacy. I think the first thing that you realize when you look at a paper two is that some of the sources are really challenging. They might be from the 1920s, the 1930s. They're political correspondents, they're journalists writing for an educated audience, they're politicians speaking in the House of Commons. They're not writing or speaking for a 15-year-old audience in the
Mhm.
21st century. So I think there is often a lot of vocabulary in the sources themselves, which can be quite challenging, quite off-putting.
Yeah,
The some of the examples that we look through together, a few of the sentences really do require two or three readings to understand.
yeah.
Um, I think the major point for students is to tell them and make it very clear to them that what I've just mentioned to you, that there will be sources that are not designed to be entirely accessible to them. And the main thing, I think, is being confident enough to get general impressions from
Hmm.
sources. I may not understand every single word or every single turn of phrase in a source,
Yeah.
and we need to train students to not be intimidated by that. Um, Especially because actually with those paper twos, the higher levels of the mark scheme are usually talking about the overall message or the big message or the purpose, and getting a general impression is usually enough for
Okay,
that.
cool.
I think
Um,
where vocabulary really is key is in the questions themselves.
right.
The difference between reliability, usefulness, to evaluate. And I
Yeah.
think those are the things that we can train students to really understand.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
a real part of their disciplinary literacy.
Yeah, great. When you're reading the text or reading the questions, you probably just answered this. Maybe you could just go into a bit more. Are you looking out for any particular words, maybe in the text first and then secondly in the question? What kind of words
Yeah,
stand out for you when you're reading those things?
yeah. So I think in the doing it the other way around, I think in the question, it's those command words. And I think this is very common in any subject. And it's a real, I think, a cornerstone of the idea of disciplinary literacy, which is, what sorts of things is my subject asking me to do?
Mhm.
And in history, that is often, somewhere on the spectrum of describe, explain, evaluate, justify, make an argument.
Yeah.
These paper twos also include words like purpose in the questions, intention, and then these very strange sort of comparative questions where you're asked, does this source prove that this source is wrong, or does this source make this source surprising? So we're training students to identify questions by type.
Yeah. I
And
know
we
and
might
that
refer.
sounds like they're very, very different to other subjects, those kind of command words and those kinds of tasks that students are asked to do.
Yeah, I think they probably are.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the idea of evaluating text or evaluating claims might be common in most arts-based subjects or
Yeah,
English
but definitely
literature.
not the purpose or the intention or whether one proves another.
Yeah, and that idea of purpose and intention, I think, it's a very history skill. What is the in the context in this was created, the paper that we've been looking at on the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
In the context it was created, in the world that it was made, why was it created? What did the author want it to do? I think that is a very history type question.
Yeah.
So training students to recognize those command words, I think, is one of the big aspects of
Okay.
disciplinary literacy.
Within
Um,
the yeah, within the physical kind of act of reading, what do you read first? What do you give more importance to when you kind of sit down and look at this kind of paper?
Yeah, so I think for each individual question, I read the question first. I then read the provenance or the origin of the source or any additional information given about the origin, and then I'd read the text itself.
Okay.
Um, and I think that's for me a very logical process of what am I being asked here? Because a lot of these texts can be quite long; they can make several points. So I need to know what am I actually looking out for, and I think I then want to know, you know, is this a letter? Is it a transcript of a speech? The basics of provenance. Then I'd read the text itself, and then maybe I'd go back to the provenance and just check, okay, who wrote this and when? and then I might be able to start to make links between those ideas. But I think always starting with the question is really essential.
And when you're reading, how much are you bringing your own knowledge to reading those sources? I mean, you're obviously a long-standing historian, been doing this for many, many years at a very, very high level, and our students necessarily aren't. So what is it that you're bringing, or are you bringing as much as maybe I think you are, to the reading of these texts? Or are you just taking it at face value? What you see is what you get?
I think this is one of the really interesting differences between, high level academic history and, say, a GCSE, which is that many of these GCSE questions and mark schemes will actually discourage an over reliance on contextual knowledge. And I think that's, in some ways, it's about leveling the playing field and so on. But actually, I think you'd have to be very careful with source-based questions that they don't become questions in which you over rely on your own knowledge. And what I think is really interesting about the paper two here is that they give you some context at the start of the paper. And for most of the questions, the context at the start of the paper and the provenance given about the sources is sufficient to answer all of the questions well.
Right.
And the danger sometimes can be to ignore sources and to write more generally about the topic. So, if there's a question that's talking about, to what extent do these two sources suggest that Hitler managed to conceal the degree of German involvement in the Spanish Civil War? It could be very, very easy to start just talking about the degree to which the international community was aware of German intervention in the Spanish Civil War. But if I don't actually engage with those sources, I've made the cardinal error of not answering the question. So I think actually sometimes students having less contextual knowledge can be beneficial with these. They have to know enough to situate and interpret the sources.
Yeah.
But actually they don't want to, it's almost beneficial sometimes that they're not drowning in that knowledge. It can be overwhelming.
Is that the same for the final question in this paper? I think the final question asks a bit more for the students to bring what they know about the subject into it. Is that right?
Again, I think yes and no, because the question is very much an open question. It's the most like a university written test or written question, right? But the upfront words are, how far do these sources provide convincing evidence?
Yeah.
And the sort of the final clause says, use the sources to explain your answer. Yeah. And actually doesn't mention it. And often this is something we have to teach in terms of disciplinary literacy. If they want you to draw on own knowledge, they'll usually say, use the sources and your own knowledge. Right. That last question, it very explicitly doesn't mention your own knowledge, because it's not really, unlike other questions in other history papers, it's not asking you to make a convincing argument about the about the controversy. Mm-hmm. It's asking you to make a convincing holistic evaluation of the sources in front of you. I think they're subtly different things.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's think a little bit more about writing. Writing as an historian, what is the balance between fact and opinion interpretation? What is it that you're trying to achieve as a good writer in historian that maybe our students don't always achieve?
I think the big issue, and going outside of the paper two here and just talking more generally, I think it's the sense that you're not so much talking about fact and opinion, I think, insofar as you're talking about argument or interpretation, mm-hmm. and then evidence to support that. Right. And I think this is something that most historians don't grapple with until university. I think it's the more we introduce the idea of a sort of a contested past early to students, the better. The idea of historical interpretation, which is that any benign fact, this thing happened, or this person said this thing, that fact can be used as evidence to support a sort of a multitude of different arguments, and it takes on a very different shape depending on what kind of argument it's supporting. Mm-hmm. So students have a body of evidence. By the end of a GCSE course, they'll have a fairly rich and wide body of evidence. But beyond the most basic questions of describe the events of the Paris Peace Conference or list Wilson's 14 points. Beyond those, low marking knowledge questions, that knowledge has to be used to sustain or support a wider argument.
Okay.
And I think that that idea of opinion or interpretation actually leads most often in history with what we might call facts to support it. And that is a really good reflection of how historians work as well. You'll get your body of evidence, you'll do your weekly reading list at university or your months of research as a postgraduate or a professional historian.
Mm-hmm.
You'll take that and then you'll fit it into and you'll use it to sustain and support your argument, your point. And that's what students are being asked to do in the higher marking, the higher scoring paper 1 questions at the GCSE. It's what they're being asked to do in paper 4, which is one big interpretation. It's what they're asked to do at A-level more often than not as well. So I'd say it's actually interpretation or opinion overwhelmingly more importantly than just facts, because that's always used as a means to support.
Right. One question that we haven't discussed earlier, which just sort of springs to mind, is when you're reading history, so whether that be a book that you've picked up, an article, a journal, a website, whatever it might be, are those what you've just mentioned there about the importance of interpretation and the contested past? Is that what you're trying to read for? Is that what you're judging a piece of writing on when you're reading it?
I would say typically yes, and I think arguably the less knowledge you have about a period or a topic, the more likely you are to just be trying to kind of build up that knowledge base. It would be very different for me picking up, say, a book about the sort of mid-Roman Republic that I studied a lot at university and have a kind of schema of knowledge for, versus if I picked up a book on the Mughal Empire in India. I'd kind of be like, okay, I'm a little bit out of the depth here. I'm working to get knowledge. But as soon as you start sort of digging deeper into topics, the thing that I'm really looking for is, what does this author think about this topic? What are the big, broad, analytical or evaluative or explanatory points they're trying to make? How do they explain the events they're describing? Because if they're just describing the events, probably I might as well just, go onto Wikipedia and do it in half the time. The professional historian, I think, and the academic historian explains, justifies, argues, interprets, reinterprets. I think that's what makes the discipline interesting. And that's often been used as a sort of a delineation between a historian and, say, a chronicler or a diarist. That ability to synthesize and explain.
Right, great. Thank you so much for all of that. That's been